we need a king who can die for us. Again, 2 Samuel 18. Try and get through 10 through verse 33. Now, this morning, as I was getting ready for this message, I, in God's providential timing, came across probably one of the saddest Christian blogs that I've ever read. It was by Tim Challies, who is known as the world's most famous Christian blogger. If you're not familiar with him, challies.com is a great resource of things Christian life and living. And he wrote, the title just caught my eye. My son, my dear son, has gone to be with the Lord. His opening words were, in all the years I've been writing, I have never had to type words more difficult, more devastating than these. Yesterday, the Lord called my son to himself, my dear son, my sweet son, my kind son, my godly son, my only son. I can barely read those words without tears as I try and imagine myself in that situation. Nick Challies, who was his son, was hanging out with friends and his fiance and his sister in Louisville, Kentucky, where he was attending college. He was a junior. They were playing games with a bunch of other students in a nearby park, and he just fell over. Closed his eyes, died, and they rushed him to the hospital and never woke up. They have no explanation yet, or at least it's been published. The school is preparing for his memorial service, but just nothing like that done. Tim wrote on his blog, talking about him and his wife and the sorrow they were having. He said, we looked each other in the eye and said, we can do this. We don't want to do this, but we can do this. This sorrow, this grief, this devastation, because we know we don't have to do it in our own strength. We can do it like Christians, like a son and daughter of the Father who knows what it is to lose a son. That's heavy, and I bring this up because I think, and some of you have experienced this or have family who've experienced it closer than I have, but I think we can all imagine it. And we can get a sense of what David goes through when he hears his son Absalom is dead. And he cries, my son, in sorrow. And all the pain, because it is somewhat because of his ongoing sin that this happens. It's because of his lust and his bad parenting and just the devastation that is. It wasn't even just an accident. Like, he had something to do with it. But David did not yet know what we know and the hope that Tim Challies points to. He did not know yet the hope of a Father in heaven who knows what it is to lose his son. And not just to lose his son, but to lose his son in our place. And this is where we're going with this, is that David foreshadows his great desire to die in the place of his son, but he cannot do it because, like us, he's stained with sin. But he has a descendant, a child, Jesus Christ, the perfect God-man, who's able to die in our place so that even when we die or our children die, there can be hope of eternal life, of being reborn, resurrected. Sorry, reborn gets into the whole rebirth cycle stuff again. So I'm not trying to go there. But that's where we're going, along with David. What? It just happened yesterday. This was published today. He died yesterday or the day before that. I think it was yesterday. And I think they drove on it. 2 other girls. The daughter was with the son playing games in the park when that happened. So let's see how this happens with David. Because this is a very extrapolated passage that's really trying to bring us into the sorrow of David. Now, before we get there, we do have to go back and finish what we started last week. The 4 examples of apparent pride, which revealed the difference between pride and assurance. That there were these people, there was different people who were sure. So David was sure of victory. He trusted both God and his men, his soldiers. We talked about how David was sure because in Psalm 3, he wrote Psalm 3, verse 7 and 8, Yahweh, save me, O my God, for you strike all my enemies on the cheek. You break the teeth of the wicked. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Your blessing be on your people. Selah. And Psalm 3 was written as he was leaving Jerusalem and Absalom was chasing him. So he was sure. But we also saw Absalom's foolish trust in large forces proved fruitless for him. Now, if you remember, Absalom gathered a large force and he was going up against David and his military genius. And why did Absalom think he could win? He had a larger army. He had such a large force that 20,000 people died in it, and that was just the losses. Their force was larger than that. But his pride was against God, and so we saw his pride was actually, though he was caught in trees on the way, the trees devastated him, and he was opposed by God. We mentioned that he tries to build a remembrance of himself in the Valley of the Kings to show how great he was, but he wasn't defeated by David's forces. Look in 18 verse 8. As the battle spread over all the face of the country, what devours more people than even David's army? The forest. The trees defeat him. He thinks his army is so great, and in fact, the trees themselves take them down. As Absalom himself goes running, he is captured not by David's forces, but a tree picks him up by the hair and hangs him in the air. And though he might try to escape, he's so stuck with no one to help him that a soldier from David's army comes, sees him, goes away, reports it, and comes back, and he's still hanging there helpless. His pride has put him down. But David's man, Joab, is also prideful. And we're going to see Joab's prideful rejection of the king's command. Verses 11 through 17. It starts off with Absalom. He comes and becomes aware of Absalom's situation in 11 through 13. As he says, Joab said to the man who told him, "What? You saw him? Why did you not strike him there to the ground? I would have been glad to give you 10 pieces of silver and a belt." But the man said to Joab, "Even if I felt my hand the weight of 1,000 pieces of silver, I would not reach out my hand against the king's son. For in our hearing, the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai, for my sake, protect the young man Absalom. On the other hand, if I had dealt treacherously against his life, and there is nothing hidden from the king, then you yourself would have stood aloof." So Joab hears from this soldier who comes running to him, "Hey, I got news. Absalom is hanging in a tree. He's just stuck there. We got to go get him." And Joab responds, "Why in the world is he alive?" Just the word strike is the same word used as to slaughter. It means to just stab him repeatedly. Why is he still alive there? And he's like, "I would have given you a great reward of silver and a belt." Now, remember, look back at verse 5. What did David tell all the soldiers to do with Absalom? Deal gently. Is slaughtering him dealing gently? No. But notice his phrase. Notice what Joab says here. He says, "I would have been glad to give you 10 pieces of silver and a belt." Number of commentators agree this isn't something he's making up on the spot. This is something that Joab probably said beforehand. Like, "I would have given you this just like I told you to. Hint, hint, come on." And this is not a small amount. Silver coins, it's probably not as engraved as this comes later, but just think of a piece of silver without the imaging on it. In Judges chapter 17, verse 10, we read that Micah says to one of the Levitical priests, "Stay with me, be a father and a priest to me, and I will give you 10 pieces of silver a year and a suit of clothes, and you're living. How many pieces of silver is he offering here? 10. And a year's worth of priestly work is worth 10 pieces of silver and some clothing. So this is not a small amount. The belt, too, would have been the belt of a soldier, would have been prized. Most normal soldiers would not have this, but maybe the elites. So this is a really good equipment, basically. Not just like hold your pants up. This is good fighting equipment, make you a better soldier. This is a good option, good bribery. But he refuses. He says, I won't fall to your bribery. And look down in verse 12. He doesn't just say, I won't reject your 10 pieces. How many pieces would he reject? 1,000. He's like, basically, I don't care how much money you give me. I would never disobey the king. He made his will plain. But notice also, he has some misgivings about Joab's character. He basically says, yeah, and if I had disobeyed the king, what would Joab have done? Killed him? Or let him take all the blame for David, let David kill him, right? But he's like, you're just going to hang me out to dry. I don't trust you, Joab. Which again, tells us a little bit about what kind of man Joab is. But Joab has no time to deal with this. He's not going to debate his character. He just marches off and goes ahead and slays Absalom. Verses 14 and 15 says, Joab said, I will not waste time like this with you. And he took 3 javelins in his hand and thrust them into the heart of Absalom while he was still alive in the oak. And 10 young men, Joab's armor bearers, surrounded Absalom and struck him and killed him. So this is what's so interesting. Look back at chapter 14. Remember this story that this wise woman of Tekoa made up to draw Absalom back in? She wanted to convince David to bring Absalom back from exile. Look in verse 3. Who put the words in her mouth to convince David to bring Absalom back? Joab. Isn't it interesting? Why would Joab want Absalom dead now when before he made sure to bring him back to Israel? Yeah. Maybe he's sick and tired of David. Maybe he's tired of David's coddling of his son. He's like, it didn't actually get any better. Text doesn't say exactly why, but for whatever reason, Joab wanted him back and now is not happy with what has happened as there has been an insurrection. Joab has had to flee too. So he doesn't trust David to be a judge. He takes judgment into his own hands. In 2 Samuel 14, verse 20, it had said he had tried to change the course of the affairs. He was trying to change things, and whatever happened, he didn't like the change that resulted. So here he is trying to change it again. And he goes and marches to where Absalom is hiding, and he takes 3 sharp-pointed sticks, which the word it could be translated spears or maybe darts. So some commentators think they were actually like smaller darts, like throwing knives type things. Either way, 3 pointed sticks, and he throws them into the chest of Absalom, and he isn't dead right away, which is actually possible. It's interesting. If you take a bullet to the chest or even a knife to the chest, and you could be gushing blood, but a person could die in minutes, hours, or days, or even survive, depending on what it hits exactly. So if it happens to hit the right way, even if it goes in the heart can keep beating for a few minutes afterwards, and the person doesn't die instantly. But Absalom or Joab does not want to wait, does he? What does he tell his servants, his armor bearers? Go and kill the guy. Joab might have had his consciousness still, and all 10 of them strike at once. Possibly he ordered them all to kill him to kind of spread the blame around. It's not just Joab who did it. It's Joab and these 10 men. They all struck him. They all killed him. The battle is won, and so Joab then, after striking him, brings shame onto him. Absalom's shame by Joab, verse 16 and 17. Then Joab blew the trumpet. The troops came back from pursuing Israel, for Joab restrained them. And they took Absalom, and they threw him into a great pit in the forest, and raised over him a very great heap of stones. And all Israel fled, everyone to his own home. Fascinating how this works. So Joab, once again, takes out his horn and blows it. This is a ram's horn, or called a shofar. Are you familiar with that? Used Israelites for worship or for battle or for finishing a battle. And we saw in chapter 2 of 2 Samuel, when this trumpet was blown, everyone came back from battle. So it's just a signal. They've won. The battle is done. The king is defeated. So stop pursuing them. Well, it's going to be all okay. But they're not done. They take his body down from the tree and they bury it in a dishonorable way by throwing it into a big pit in the forest and covering it with a large heap of rocks. Now, this sounds very similar to Joshua 7, where, remember Achan? Achan stole the bacon. That's always how I remember it. Achan was that guy who got all judgment upon all of Israel because they went to Ai, and instead of burning all of the evil items, he took some of the gold and precious things and hid it because, it was money, it was precious. And he lied about it until they finally found him. And then Joshua chapter 7, verse 25 and 26 says, all Israel stoned him with stones. They burned them with fire and stoned them with stones, and they raised over him a great heap of stones that remains to this day. So what kind of message do you think Joab was trying to send here by putting this great heap of stones over Absalom's body? He was the enemy? Robert Bergen, in his commentary, gives a couple different reasons. He says, Absalom is buried here because he is excluded from the promised land. They are on the east side of the Jordan River. So Absalom isn't buried in the land of Israel. He's excluded forever from the promised land, isn't buried with his fathers. Like I said, he's identified with Achan, who troubled Israel. And he's also identified with the pagan king, Canaanite king of Ai, implying that he, like this pagan king, was an enemy to the Lord's people. And fourth, it fulfilled the Torah's demand that a rebellious son be stoned. Because what did Absalom do to his father? Did he honor his father? No. He rebelled against him, plain and simple. I think it might be tempting to see Joab's decision as very decisive, powerful, focused. Maybe even, he's willing to do the hard thing that David is not. You could say that David is being a weak leader and Joab is a strong leader here. But ultimately, Joab is being prideful in disobeying the king, and he will ultimately be judged by this, by King Solomon. We see again and again Joab's propensity to solve his problem, not God's way in seeking God's wisdom, but just to kill somebody. And we'll see him do that again in the next chapter too. Someone's in his way and he just kills them. So in 1 Kings chapter 2, David says to his son Solomon, you know what Joab, the son of Zeruiah, did to me, avenging in time of peace for blood that had been shed in war. Act therefore according to your wisdom, but do not let his gray head go down to Sheol in peace. That's 1 Kings chapter 2, verse 5 and 6. Joab will be judged. Might does not always make right. Just because Joab is successful right now, just because he's able to defeat a king, doesn't mean that he's doing the right thing. He could even be doing it for the right reasons, but he's pridefully disregarding God's will through David. And James 4:6 says, God opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. Now, moving away from pride, we're going to skip to the story of the sorrow, as David's sin makes him unable to save his son. So we talked about that pride that was leading up to this. It's the background of the story. And now David is going to want to save his son, want to die in his place. But he can't, because he too is a sinner and has even led to the situation. Now, story starts off, verse 19 through 23. The message must go to David, but it's going to have dire results. Like, this message has to get to David because David isn't on the battlefield. Remember, well, we'll get there. So, verse 19 through 23. Then Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said, let me run and carry the news to the king, and the Lord has delivered him from the hand of his enemies. And Joab said to him, you are not to carry news today. You may carry news another day, but today you shall carry no news, because the king's son is dead. Then Joab said to the Cushite, go tell the king what you have seen. The Cushite bowed before Joab and ran. Then Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said again to Joab, come what may, let me run after the Cushite. And Joab said, why will you run, my son, seeing that you have no reward for the news? Come what may, he said, I will run. So he said, run. Then Ahimaaz ran by the way of the plain and outran the Cushite. It's amazing. It's very interesting how much dialogue is in this passage. There's a lot of back and forth, even right there, and it's going to get more and more. I'll just put up a quick graphic. This is how many times the word said comes up in this passage. It comes up over and over again in just these verses. There's a lot of talking going on. Now, remember, how much did God, by the Holy Spirit, inspire to be written about the actual battle? Hint, look at verses 6 through 8. How much was written about the actual battle? Not much. How much is written about what they talked about after the battle? A whole lot. This draws our attention. I keep trying to point this out, so I hope you're noticing this. When the text slows down, when there's not a lot of action and there's just a lot of back and forth between people, you're supposed to slow down and go, why is this? And I'm trying to say, even as the lead up to this, the battle isn't really about the battle. The battle was in David's heart, or how he would respond to his own sin and the trial that he's going through. Now, Ahimaaz, the son of the priest, says to Joab, I want to go tell David the news. The Lord has rescued him. This is great. Now, he was one of the messengers who came to David when David was at the Jordan River and told him about Absalom's plan to come and strike him and said, get going now tonight. Remember, they're the ones who hid inside the well and the lady covered them with hay, right? And now he wants to bring David the good news. And he doesn't say, let me get on my horse and go there, because here he is saying, I want to go, but he can't ride a horse because it's not until the Persian Empire that they come up with a system of relays through horses. So the only way to get a message is to get out and run by foot. So he goes to Joab, let me run. And what is Joab's response in verse 20? No. Why not? Some other time, because the king's son is dead today. Basically, he says, like, there'll be other things, but I don't want you to take this message. So he turns to a non-Israelite, a Cushite, next to him. Now, this is probably Joab's slave from the land of Cush, which is south of Egypt. So he's probably a black man. Slave trade has existed for a long time. Maybe not. Maybe he's a man who's just, he said, I will serve in David's army. But either way, he's probably from Africa and is probably up here to serve David, most likely a slave, as people believe. He dutifully obeys, bows, and heads off running. But Ahimaaz is not easily discouraged. No, he is insistent on going to inform David. He wants to let David know. And so Joab assumes you must be doing it for honor. Like you just want to be praised. And he's like, you're not going to get any honor out of this, man. Why are you trying to do this? But Ahimaaz clearly wants to be loyal. He cares about the king. He wants to bring him this message. So Joab says, okay. And I love this because I love it when the Bible makes sense. Because the Bible is not a story of fables, right? It's real history. And it makes sense of the land over and over again. Verse 23 says, Ahimaaz outruns the Cushite, even though he leaves later. Why? He takes the different route, the way of the plain. So the top right, which is kind of orangey on the left there, that is the closer path. The green path on the left is the way of the plain. If David is over here in the city, makes sense. You would take the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, right? So you have to weave around a little, but that's the path. But if you look at this satellite Bible atlas, very interesting. It in certain things it's turned sideways, so actually east is up. So that's why they do that in Israelite maps. So Israeli maps do it this way. So but you can see there, the shorter path that the Cushite would have taken is this red line here. And the green line would have been the path that Ahimaaz would have taken. It's probably a mile or two longer, most scholars think. So Jerry, you help me here. You're my fellow hiker here. Why would it take longer to run a shorter path that's hilly? The brown is all hills and mountains. Why does it take longer to do a shorter but hillier path? Yeah. So you got to go uphill, takes you longer. Then you got to go downhill and uphill again. It slows you down, right? While if it's a flat zone, what are you more likely to be able to do? Run. Yeah. You can run downhill too. That's true. But then you run downhill, you got to go back up. And maybe if you run downhill, you like slip along the way. So you got to be careful, right? Whatever it is, it actually makes a lot of sense, right? Here, even today in Israel, the way of the plain is the flat plain. This is the real land. This is really where it happened. The Bible is real history. And like the news of VE Day, victory in Europe, being sent across the air, the message of David's victory is coming by foot, but it will not come to a happy recipient. We see the buildup then as the messengers reach David. We find David sitting between the gates. Now remember, he wanted to go out into battle in chapter 18, verse 2, but who in verse 3 told him not to go and to stay in the city? In verse 3, who told him to stay in the city? What? Joab. Not just Joab, though. The three top leaders. Yeah. It says the men, so probably maybe it was just the leaders, but everyone agrees at least. They wanted David to stay in safety because he's worth so much more. So he would have stayed in this inner area between the two gates, and it would allow him to provide additional support. He was able to come out and support them if they needed to, or if they're being defeated, he could send additional troops. What's interesting is the commentator Dale Davis. I love Dale. he writes so many good things on this. And he points out, this description, the way this is written, really tries to put us in the middle of David's trial. This story could say, Joab sent the king news of the battle. When David learned Absalom had perished, he went into deep mourning. It doesn't say that, does it? It says a whole lot more. Would we learn the lesson of sorrow as well if that's all it said? I don't think so. Now, we read verse, let me get there. Verse 24. David was sitting between the two gates, and the watchman went up on the roof of the gate by the wall. And he lifted up his eyes and looked, and he saw a man running alone. The man called out and told the king, and the king said, if he is alone, there is news in his mouth. Then he drew near and near. The watchman saw that another man was running, and the watchman called to the gate and said, see, another man running alone. The king said, he also brings news. The watchman said, I think the running of the first is like the running of Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok. And the king said, he is a good man and comes with good news. Again, you can kind of feel David's hope that would exist now. So the watchman is up on the roof, top of the building, looking out. It was important, even in defended cities, to always keep an eye out on the distance to know if any forces were coming. Here they're in the midst of a battle. They need information. And he's on high alert. And he sees a man coming from the east. If you look at this map, you can see where those two paths would have converged right to the east of the city. So they see one man coming, running as fast as he can. And David, being a veteran of war, realizes that a solitary man is a good thing. Because how many people would be running if they were retreating in defeat? All of them. So the fact that there's one man means this is good news. We've done well. But then the watcher sees another man coming after him. So verse 26 says the watchman calls out to the gatekeeper and the king responds, which implies that David has gone down to the front gates. He is down at the bottom waiting for an answer. He wants to hear right away what this report is. What does the messenger have? As he gets closer, the watchman can see it's Ahimaaz. So David is comforted because this is a loyal man. It's a good man. If they're sending him, it's good news. The messenger, Ahimaaz, comes up and he says in verse 28, all is well. And he bowed before the king with his face to the earth and said, blessed be the Lord God who has delivered up the men who raised their hand against my Lord, the king. The word all is well is actually just the word shalom or peace. It's just peace, king. We have peace. Things are good. God has been good to you. God has saved us just like you said he would. But does David care about winning? The king said in verse 29, is it well with the young man Absalom? Does David care at all about the good news? No, he's like, what's the one thing I want to know? Where's my son? I asked you to be gentle with him. How is my son? And Ahimaaz kind of fudges the issue. He says, verse 29, when Joab sent the king's servant, your servant, I saw a great commotion, but I do not know what it was. And the king said, turn aside and stand here. So he turned aside and stood still. So David literally responds saying, is shalom with the boy Absalom? So Ahimaaz comes and says, shalom, we have peace. And David goes, but is there shalom with my son? Ahimaaz is misleading at best because in verse 20, look at verse 20. Does he know what happened to Absalom? Joab just said, don't go. Why? The king's son is dead. He knows he's dead, but he's like, I don't know exactly what happened. I wasn't there when it happened, which is probably true, but he knows. And his lack of a direct answer makes David go, step aside. Let's wait for the second messenger. Second messenger comes, verse 31. Behold, the Cushite came, and the Cushite said, good news for my lord the king, for the Lord has delivered you this day from the hand of all who rose up against you. He's bringing basically gospel right here. It's the good news of God's victorious saving of them. But does David care about being delivered? No. The king said to the Cushite, is it well with the young man Absalom? Who is the only person David cares about right now? His son Absalom. Notice again, the Cushite doesn't answer directly. The Cushite answered, may the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up against you for evil be like that young man. David knows exactly what he's saying. He doesn't need to hear that. He's been saved from he's been saved from destruction by his traitorous son. But he doesn't care. This is the hard part. Good news doesn't always seem good. It's like the tough news where someone receives a cancer diagnosis and they might plead, oh, God, please, oh, doctor, please deal gently with my cancer. Take out most of it, but leave a tad since it's a part of me. Or maybe a better illustration is actually an arm or a leg that's gangrene. And the gangrene is spreading up you, and you're like, but please be gentle with it. See, God's victory over sin includes judgment of the sinner. I think there might be two applications from this part as we kind of enter this buildup. I want to again point out the focus on David's heart. This moment of despair is building. It could have been a short jump right to it, but it lingers in the text. And I think too often, especially these days, we're looking to battle someone out there. We want to battle against terrorists who are trying to destroy us, or cultural forces that want to change our world, or politicians or politics, progressive ideas that are destroying our world. Pastor he's done a great job on Sunday mornings recently pointing out that the battlefield is actually the Christian's heart. We got to believe this. The battlefield is the Christian's heart. And that's once more what's emphasizing here. Jonathan Edwards, America's most famous and probably smartest theologian, agrees. He said the battle of the Christian is first and foremost shown in ruling ourselves and conquering our own sin, not conquering other people. He writes, though Christian fortitude appears in withstanding and counteracting the enemies that are without us, yet it much more appears in resisting and suppressing the enemies that are within us, because they are our worst and strongest enemies and have greatest advantage over us. The strength of the good soldier in Jesus Christ appears in nothing more than steadfastly maintaining the holy calm, meekness, sweetness, benevolence of his mind amidst all the storms, injuries, strange behavior, and surprising acts and events of this evil and unreasonable world. The Christian's focus is themselves. Of course, yes, thank you. But there's also a challenge, because when the enemy is without, we must not be surprised when God will judge his enemies. God does judge, and David's time to warn his son of God's judgment was long before this. This scares me. as a father, he failed to teach his son the fear of the Lord. And we have to be careful at times. Be careful what you pray for, right? We can't always pray, deliver us from evil, unless we believe that God will destroy the evil. God's people know that the Cushite was right. In preserving God's kingdom, verse 31, God killed David's enemy, verse 32. That is why our mission is not to love the world as it is, but to preach the saving gospel to people, to be reconciled to him. And it's never too late. Like, it's too late when the judgment comes, but we continue to say, you are an enemy of God and judgment is coming for you. Like, that's our call, not just to make things comfortable and good. David, sadly, had failed at that as a father. And this is the sad result. He is unable to anymore reconcile his son to God. And so we see the result. David weeps over his son. Verse 33. It's 7:50, so we're just going to start this today, and we'll come back to it next week. But the king was deeply moved and went up to the upper chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, he said, "Oh, my son, Absalom, my son, Absalom. Would I have died instead of you? Oh, Absalom, my son, my son." David has complete realization that his son is dead from the news. And so he takes the path up to the top flat part of the building above the gates, and there he begins to weep. Now, is this the only time David has received news that a political or military enemy has died and he weeps? No, he's done this many times before. He did it when Saul died, when obviously Jonathan died, even when his military enemy Abner died. But think of it this way as well. When David committed adultery with Bathsheba, then he was caught, and finally, as a consequence of that sin, his child, born from that adultery, dies. Did David continue to weep? If you want to go to chapter 12, verse 23. In chapter 12, verse 23, they go, why you were fasting when the child was alive. Now the child is dead. What are you doing? And he said, now he is dead. Why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I shall go to him, but he will not return to me. Why did David stop weeping when his child died? I think he believed he would see him again. He had complete confidence that he would see him in heaven. But is there any hope here? None. Like, again, as a father, this terrifies me. Being in a place with a dead child, looking at their life and saying, I have no confidence whatsoever that they trusted Christ before they died. So then, what is David's wish? What does David in here wish he could have done? Died in his place, right? But he can't. And not just because there was a military battle. No, because think of it this way. David could have just given up, allowed his son to be king and be killed in his place. But then Absalom would have lived years and died, and what would have been this result? Still facing judgment from God. Either way. The controlling verse for this section is 2 Samuel 12, 11 and 12, where Yahweh said, I will raise up evil against you from your own house. I will take your wives before your eyes and give them to your neighbor, and he shall lie with your wives in the sight of the sun. For what you did secretly, I will do this thing before all Israel and before the sun. David must know right now his sin caused this. His sin, both the fact that he sinned with Bathsheba and was receiving judgment, then when his oldest son Amnon raped Tamar, he did nothing. And then Absalom killed Amnon and he did nothing. And he is experiencing this. And Absalom has become a wicked man. And David's sin means he could never take the place of his son. He probably knew Solomon was going to be king. He had been told by David that God loved him. And he promised Bathsheba that he would be king, as we see there. But even he kind of waffles on a little bit when we actually finally get to 1 Kings. So maybe it was his old age, but either way, he didn't want his other sons to die. We know, though, this side of the cross, the fulfillment to David's wish to die in the place of his son would require a sinless sacrifice who could actually die in his place. And this came in Hebrews chapter 7. Verse 26 and 27, Jesus talking about him, he says, it's fitting that we should have a high priest who's holy, who's innocent, who's unstained, who's separated from sinners and is exalted above the heavens. He has no need, like all those other high priests, to offer sacrifices daily, first for his own sins and then for the sins of his people, since he did this once for all when he offered up himself. Hebrews 7, 26 and 27. See, what Jesus offers is what's known as, you guys seen this before, it's the great exchange. Jesus takes our place, dying, as David said, instead of you and me. And our sin is transferred to him. He becomes our sin, but then Jesus's righteousness becomes ours when we are joined to him. It's like a fabulously wealthy prince marrying a woman who's in debtor's prison. Jesus is the great king who looks at his bride, who is completely unlovable and is in prison because she cannot pay off her debts, and he marries her. And he absorbs all her debt and out of his riches pays for it. And she becomes his and goes and lives with him and becomes part of his family. See, even if death is expected, we cannot prepare for it. Now, David knew there is a good chance his son could die because they're in war. He doesn't even know how he died yet, but when it does happen, there's war. His son could die. But when we experience the sorrow of death, and we'll come back and talk about this more next week with some practical ways to walk through this, we can point to the one who defeated death, the one who died in our place, so that even when we die, there is hope of resurrection. See, we remember God's wins because in the end, healing triumphs over losses. Hope triumphs over hurt. Grace triumphs over works. Faith triumphs over doubt. Hope triumphs over despair. Love triumphs over separation. Life triumphs over death. Good triumphs over evil. And God triumphs over the devil. The one nice thing Tim Challies can say is that he will see his son again because his son trusted Jesus. And the hope is no matter where we are at, no matter how far someone has gone down the path, as long as they still breathe, there is a opportunity for God to work in their heart. And we should be part of that, to still be a message of reconciliation to them, because Jesus doesn't just defeat death. He saves those who deserve it, like you and me. And he triumphs even over losses. It's 8 o'clock. Let me pray. We can discuss for a few minutes. You guys have any thoughts? And we'll talk more about some of the issues of sorrow and how David works through that and how we're supposed to work through that a little more next week. Let me pray.